Myth has so enshrouded every aspect of the Alamo story that it becomes difficult, not impossible, but difficult, to separate the factual from the fanciful. A parochial chauvinism generated traditional myths, a desire to extol doomed defenders beyond the point that evidence merited. Yet newer myths also evolved, generated by politically correct trends that sought to undermine time-honored traditions. Like older myths, these were also unsupported by documentation. It is useful to define terms. I'm a professor, and well, that's what we do. I am also mindful of self-preservation. When I have discussed the role of myth in Texas history, it has often generated contentious question and answer sessions afterwards. Inevitably, a fuming member of the audience asked questions like this one. "Tell me, Dr. Hardin." And they always say it like that, with a disdain that most people reserve for words like pedophile. "Tell me, Dr. Hardin, when you talk about the Alamo myth, are you claiming that those brave men didn't actually die there, that it's just a fairy story someone made up?" Well, that's one definition of the word, an unfounded or false notion, but not the one at play today. No, the operating definition is a usually traditional story of ostensibly historical events that serves to unfold a part of the worldview of a people or explain a practice, belief, or natural phenomenon. The Battle of the Alamo is a perfect example of this second definition. Hardly had the smoke cleared over the old mission before Texans began to describe the episode in mythic terms. Less than 3 weeks after the battle, a Texas newspaperman employed fulsome diction to pay homage to the fallen defenders. "Spirits of the mighty, though fallen, honors and rest are with ye. The spark of immortality which animated your forms shall brighten into a flame, and Texas, the whole world, shall hail ye as the demigods of old, as founders of new action, and as patterns of imitation." 4 years later, Texians had codified the rhetoric. Upon visiting San Antonio, A.B. Lawrence waxed elegiac. "Will not in future days Bear be classic ground? Is it not by victory and the blood of heroes, consecrated to liberty and sacred to the fame of patriots, who there repose upon the very ground they defended with their last breath and last drop of generous blood? Will Texians ever forget them, or cease to prize the boom for which these patriots bled? Forbid it, honor, virtue, patriotism. Let every Texian bosom be the monument sacred to their fame, and every Texian freeman emulous of their virtues." Thus, almost immediately, the battle lost its factual content, ceased to be a calamitous military defeat, becoming instead a paradigm of honor, virtue, and patriotism. It became, as Madam Stewart might describe it, a good thing. It should then come as no surprise that Texans began to embellish the Alamo story. No praise of fallen defenders could be too effusive. No estimation of slain soldados at the foot of Jim Bowie's sickbed could be too high. No presumptions of Mexican malice could be too excessive. The parable became the central scene of a Lone Star morality play, a melodrama in which slain champions served as primordial types. Consider, for example, this paradigm of purple prose contained within a popular textbook. The Mexicans, bleeding, wounded, and shattered, hesitated to renew the attack, but the stern commands of Santana and the flashing sabers of the cavalry forced them on. By tens, by hundreds, they swarmed up the ladders. Down fell the first, down went the second, crushing all beneath them, while the Texans stood like gods, waiting to let others feel their mighty strength. Friends, you can't make this up. Miss Pennypacker. We'll hear more about her. Such perceptions survived the Romantic 19th century and thrived even into the mid-20th century. In 1960, John Wayne described his film, The Alamo, as the story of 185 men joined together in an immortal pact to give their lives that the spark of freedom might blaze into a roaring flame. It is the story of how they died to the last man, putting up an unbelievably gallant fight against an overwhelming enemy, and of the priceless legacy they left us. Duke unintentionally identified the problem with the mythic Alamo. It is indeed unbelievably gallant. Nevertheless, those of a certain age who grew up with the Walt Disney version, who wore coonskin caps and sang, "Davy, Davy Crockett." No, that's enough. Until it drove our parents to distraction, are frequently aggrieved when some egghead tells us that our boyhood hero may not have gone down swinging old Betsy a la Fess Parker. We are chagrined when our children and grandchildren who did not grow up with Fess Parker and John Wayne fail to share our enthusiasm for the traditional story. The bombast and lack of credibility tends to alienate younger people who, quite rightly, demand to examine the evidence. But enough of professorial pontificating. Let's get down to cases. Myth 1. The defenders were foolish to have defended the Alamo because the fort was of no military significance. This is a newer myth, or perhaps a counter-myth, one that suggests that far from heroes, Bowie and Travis were blithering idiots for attempting to hold a post of no military significance. Those who hold this view tend to view the battle only in tactical terms. To fathom the encounter fully, one must appreciate it in its strategic context. What an 1836 map revealed would have been obvious to any general worthy of his epaulets. Two major roads led into Texas from the Mexican interior. The first was the Atascocito Road, which stretched from Matamoros on the Rio Grande northward through San Patricio, Goliad, Victoria, and finally into the heart of Austin's colony. The second was the old San Antonio Road, a Camino Real that crossed the Rio Grande and wound northward through San Antonio de Bexar, Bastrop, Nacogdoches, San Augustine, and across the Sabine River into Louisiana. Yet what was manifest to Santana was equally clear to Texian leaders who took steps to block these vital arteries. 2 forts barred these approaches into Texas, and each functioned as a frontier picket post: Presidio La Bahia at Goliad and the Alamo in San Antonio. James Clinton Neal received command of the Bayard garrison. Some 90 miles to the southeast, James Walker Fannin Jr. subsequently took command at Goliad. Both Neal and Fannin determined to stall the Centralists on the frontier. Still, they labored under no delusions. Without speedy reinforcements, neither the Alamo or the Presidio La Bahia could long stand. The self-styled Napoleon of the West sought to emulate the French emperor. Santana planned to strike swiftly, hurl his units along parallel roads, and achieve strategic surprise. Ignorant of his intentions, the rebels would disperse forces to check his multiple drives. Then he would concentrate his battalions to deliver a hammer blow where the enemy was weakest in classic Napoleonic style. The Generalissimo anticipated ensnaring the rebels in a strategic pincer movement. On February 16th, he crossed the Rio Grande with the bulk of his army. The following day, General Jose Urrea forded downriver at Matamoros with about 500 infantry and cavalry. Barreling up the Atascocito Road, his mission was to retake Goliad. San Antonio de Bexar was the linchpin of Santana's strategy. Bexar was held by the enemy, he explained, and it was necessary to open the door to our future operations by taking it. Once he had reduced the Alamo, the town could serve as a supply depot, a stopover for weary soldados, and a springboard against rebel enclaves. His officers, however, whispered behind their hands that other issues may have influenced Santana's plans. Some observed that Goliad, which controlled the entire Texas coastline, was actually of more strategic importance than Bexar. Even so, Bexar was the political hub of Tejas, a consideration of no mean importance. Although Travis had initially objected to his posting, once there he began calling Bexar the key to Texas. Like Neal and Bowie, Travis came to realize that the best way to protect Texian families in eastern Texas was to prevent the enemy from passing through San Antonio. One may argue the tactics of the battle, but to assert that the Alamo and San Antonio was of no strategic significance is absurd. Myth 2. Houston ordered the Alamo abandoned. By willfully disobeying this order, the defenders were agents of their own destruction. Had they only followed Houston's orders, they could have prevented their annihilation. On January 17, 1836, General Sam Houston wrote Governor Henry Smith that he had ordered Colonel James Bowie and a company of volunteers to San Antonio. Traditional misunderstanding of the letter's contents created one of the most consistent canards of the Alamo story. For the careful reader, Houston's own words clarify the matter. I have ordered the fortifications of the town of Bexar to be demolished, and if you think well of it, I will remove all the cannon and other munitions of war to Gonzales and Copano, blow up the Alamo and abandon the place, as it will be impossible to keep up the station with volunteers. The sooner I can be authorized, the better it will be for the country. Houston clearly wanted to raise the Alamo, but it is likewise obvious that he was asking Smith's permission to do so. Smith and the council could concur on few issues, but on this occasion, both the governor and the council agreed they must maintain San Antonio. On January 19th, Bowie rode into the Alamo. What he saw impressed him. The old mission had begun to look like a real fort. The post commander, Colonel James C. Neal's arguments and leadership electrified Bowie. He declared that he and Neal had resolved to die in these ditches before they would surrender the post. Bowie's letters confirmed the governor's view of the defensibility of the Alamo. Smith and the council had already concluded that Bayer must be held, and Bowie's judgment only strengthened his determination. Rejecting Houston's plan, Smith prepared to funnel reinforcements and provisions to the Alamo. Houston did not dispatch orders to abandon the Alamo, only to have Neal and Bowie ignore them. In brief, Houston had asked for permission to evacuate the post. The politicians considered his request. The answer was an unequivocal no. After the Texas government fell apart, both Governor Smith and the council directed Neal to stand his ground. While the general thought it was prudent, there was never a directive from Houston to evacuate the fort for Neal and Bowie, and later Travis, to disobey. Myth 3. Alamo defenders joined together in an immortal pact to give their lives that the spark of freedom might blaze into a roaring flame. Many people assume that Alamo offenders knew from the beginning that they were doomed. Travis did not enter the fort to achieve a glorious death, but to hold it until reinforcements arrived. He made that clear in his famous letter of February 24th. Then I call on you in the name of liberty, of patriotism, and everything dear in the American character to come to our aid with all dispatch. As the siege continued and none of the promised aid appeared, Travis became anxious, then angry. On March 3rd, he wrote to the delegates of the Independence Convention, then assembled in the town of Washington. Colonel Fannin is said to be on the march to this place with reinforcements, but I fear it is not true, as I have repeatedly sent to him for aid without receiving any. I look to the colonies alone for aid. Unless it arrives soon, I shall have to fight the enemy on his own terms. I will, however, do the best I can under the circumstances. Later the same day, Travis revealed even more bitterness in a letter to his friend Jesse Grimes. I am determined to perish in defense of this place, and my bones shall reproach my country for her neglect. All this prompts an obvious question. Why did Texian leaders ignore Travis's repeated calls for assistance? It is a fact that Texans dislike admitting, but the provisional government that should have and could have organized relief efforts had fallen apart because of its bickering, dissension, and discord. When Texian delegates finally assembled in Washington to organize a new government on March 1st, it was too late for the men besieged inside the Alamo. They were as much victims of political malfeasance as enemy bayonets. Given his faith in his fellow citizens and compatriots, Travis found it difficult to accept that his superiors had placed him and his men in harm's way only to forsake them through sheer ineptness and indifference. Even so, that is what happened. Travis was not, as some insisted, a young man with a death wish. The men of the Alamo were not part of an obsessive death cult, nor were they Japanese kamikazes bent on ritual suicide. Such fanaticism was no part of their cultural tradition. The defenders were citizen soldiers. They may have been willing to die for their country, but that was never their purpose. They fervently prayed that such a sacrifice would be unnecessary. It would never have occurred to them to join in an immortal pact to give their lives, and that knowledge makes their sacrifice more, not less heroic. When their political leaders neglected them, Travis and his garrison did as they promised. They fought the enemy on his own terms and did the best they could under the circumstances. What more could anyone possibly ask of them? In a voice trembling with emotion, Travis told his men that death was inevitable and showed that he had detained them thus long, hoping for reinforcements. Drawing his sword, he drew a line in front of his men and cried, "Those who wish to die like heroes and patriots, come over to me." There was no hesitation. In a few minutes, every soldier, save one, had crossed. Even the wounded dragged themselves across the fatal mark. This, the most cherished of all Alamo myths, is also one of the most incredible. Here is the timeline. French immigrant Louis Moses Rose left the Alamo on or about March 3rd. After many hardships, he made his way to East Texas, where he took refuge in the home of Abraham and Mary Ann Zuber, where he related his story. The Zubers had a son, William Physick, who was 15 years of age in 1836. Over the years, he learned the tale of the mysterious visitor from his parents, but not until 1872, 35 years after the fact, did he publish his account of Rose's escape in the Texas Almanac, wherein he related the story of Travis's line. Zuber's account was highly detailed. Even at the time, many wondered how he could have known the exact wording of Travis's speech. Responding to his critics, Zuber wrote to the Adjutant General on September 14, 1877. In this letter, Zuber confessed to fabricating the speech, but claimed that he had based it on information Rose had provided his parents. He further admitted that he had concocted a paragraph out of whole cloth. I found a deficiency in the material of the speech, which, from my knowledge of the man, I thought I could supply. I accordingly threw in one paragraph, which I firmly believed to be characteristic of Travis, and without which the speech would have been incomplete. As Walter Lord observed, Zuber never said what the passage was, but the omission itself was significant. The line was the crux of the whole speech, the center of the controversy. If his concoction, without which the speech would have been incomplete, was not the line, it seems he would have said so, for this was the one thing everyone wanted to know. So the line appeared to have been an element that he threw in as characteristic of Travis. It is true that survivors Susanna Hardin, that's Mrs. Dickinson's married name, and Enrique Esparza also referenced the lying tale, but not until long after Zuber had published his article and the public had embraced it. Mrs. Hardin botched the story completely. As she told it, Travis invited those who wished to leave to cross the line. Even more damning, she has this pivotal event take place on the first day of the siege. Despite all the inconsistencies, many could not let the fable go. As one crotchety Texan argued in the pages of Southwestern Historical Quarterly, "Is there any proof that Travis didn't draw the line? If not, let us believe it." Friends, that is not the way history works. At least not professional history. History is not something that might have happened or we wish had happened. History is what documents prove did happen. By that standard, the line story does not even come close. Nowadays, most Alamo scholars reject the tale. In Texian Iliad, I gently dismissed it, stating, according to legend, Travis drew a line in the dust with his saber, inviting all who were resolved to stay and die with him to cross. Evidence does not support the tale, but apparently Travis did gather the men for a conference. In 1998, William C. Davis was far more emphatic in his rigorously researched 3 roads to the Alamo. Nothing in this story stands up to scrutiny, he insisted. So far as this present work is concerned, the event simply did not happen, or if it did, something more reliable than an admittedly fictionalized second-hand account written 35 years after the fact is necessary to establish it beyond question. Nevertheless, the line myth recently received a patron when James Donovan, author of The Blood of Heroes, professed to believe it had actually happened. Even so, in his afterword, he admitted that he had based his faith upon, quote, second-hand and third-hand or circumstantial evidence. This is hardly a ringing endorsement. Indeed, those are the same complaints academic historians have had with the line fable since Zuber first introduced it in 1872. The 13-day Alamo siege brought Houston the precious time he needed to raise and train the Texian army. This myth is easy to refute. His biographers have carefully documented the general's movements, and as Walter Lord observed with eloquent understatement, Sam Houston was strangely inactive during most of the siege. On February 23rd, he was in East Texas negotiating with the Cherokees as an emissary of the deposed Governor Smith. On February 29th, he arrived in the town of Washington, where he served as a delegate to the Independence Convention. On March 4th, delegates reconfirmed him as commander of the Texian army. On March 6th, Houston promised, if mortal power could avail, he would personally lead a detachment to relieve the brave men of the Alamo. Of course, the Alamo had already fallen earlier that same morning. Houston finally joined the army at Gonzales on March 11th. Obviously, the stand of Travis and his men had not bought Houston the precious time he needed to train the Texian army. Even so, the 13-day siege did delay Santana's advance through Texas. Without the Alamo siege, he would have likely routed the members of the Independence Convention before they finished their business of writing a constitution for the Republic of Texas. The siege produced political dividends, but Houston did not begin his military duties until the Alamo had already fallen. An artillery battery finally brought about what Santana had been trying to accomplish for 11 days. A sizable breach was battered in the east end of the plaza's north wall. Now that passage appears in John Myers Myers' 1948 book, The Alamo. Published in 1955, Frederick Ray's The Story of the Alamo, an illustrated history of the siege and fall of the Alamo, affirmed, by March 5th, Mexican cannon had breached the north wall. Moreover, the sizable breach story also appeared in more highbrow treatments, including Lon Tinkle's bestseller, 13 Days to Glory, The Siege of the Alamo, published that same year. Tinkle even included an illustration of the compound showing the breach in the north wall. Both 1955's The Last Command and 1960's The Alamo included scenes that had the wall crumbling during the March 6 assault and Mexican assault troops flooding through. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, most Texans accepted the breach in the wall as gospel. The exception was Walter Lord's A Time to Stand. He made no mention of a breach, and his illustration of the compound depicted the north wall standing intact. Curiously, contemporary accounts also failed to reference any breach. As late as March 3rd, Travis can boast, I have fortified this place so the walls are generally proof against cannonballs, and I shall strengthen the walls by throwing up dirt. Eyewitness Mexican reports recount the difficulty they had climbing over the north wall, but none recalled a yawning hole in it, a detail they surely would have mentioned. So how was it that the breach in the wall became entrenched in the public imagination? Tinkle's 13 Days to Glory provided a clue. In a note to the bird's eye view of the compound, Tinkle reveals that it was based on sketches by Lieutenant J. Edmund Blake in 1845 and Lieutenant Edward Everett in 1846, and on the map drawn by Captain R.M. Potter after his visit to the Alamo in 1841. Of course, those officers sketched the Alamo as it appeared after the battle. None claimed to know what it looked like during the 1836 siege. They were likely unaware that following the battlefield disaster at San Jacinto, General Vicente Fiasola ordered General Juan Jose Andrade to demolish the Alamo and evacuate Bayer. On May 22nd, Dr. Joseph Bernard, a captive American physician, noted, they are now busy as bees tearing down walls, etc. In the years following 1836, many tourists visited the Alamo and commented on its ruined condition. Blake, Everett, and Potter no doubt saw a breach and believed that Santana's cannon had created it. No. Yet it is almost certain that Andrade's picks and sledgehammers produced the sizable breach in the north wall. Twice he charged, then blew recall. On the fatal third time, Santa Anna breached the wall, and he killed them one and all. And the ghost of Marty Robbins will thank me for not singing them. Many of the traditional accounts of the battle assert that on March 6, Mexican assault troops required 3 separate attacks to penetrate the Alamo's defenses. The May 25, 1836 edition of the Frankfurt Commonwealth ran a highly detailed recounting of the final assault with some particulars supplied by Mrs. Dickinson. The enemy 3 times applied their scaling ladders to the walls. Twice they were beaten back, the article recounted. But numbers and discipline prevailed over valor and desperation. On the 3rd attempt, they succeeded and then came over like sheep. Anna J.H. Pennypacker's New History of Texas for Schools transferred this version to generations of Texas school children. And there's Miss Anna herself. Then the movies took up the tale, most notably in 1954's Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier. By 1960, when Marty Robbins released his Ballad of the Alamo, the fable was well ensconced in popular imagination. Alamo widow Susanna Dickinson was responsible for this old canard. In 1876, during her interview with the Adjutant General's office, she recalled, "On the morning of 6 March about daylight, enemy threw up signal rocket and advanced and were repulsed. They rallied and made second assault with scaling ladders, first thrown up on east side of fort. Terrible fight ensued. Witness retired into a room of old church and so no part of the fight, although she could distinctly hear it." Later, in the 1881 interview for the San Antonio Daily Express, the number of attacks had changed. 3 times the Mexican assault troops were repulsed, and 2 cannon planted high upon the ramparts carried dismay with their belches of fire and lead. 5 minutes, my goodness. All of Mrs. Dickinson's accounts offer complications. In the first place, she was illiterate. Consequently, all of her accounts take the form of answers to questions posed to her by others. Her testimony to the Adjutant General's office is hastily scribbled notes by an unknown party. Reporters heavily edited nearly all of her interviews. Clearly, neither of these methods was conducive to an accurate recollection of a historical event. Additionally, the lengthy period between the incident and her recounting of it was also a cause for concern. Her testimony to the Adjutant General's office came 40 years after the event. Her Daily Express interview was 45 years later. She recalled 2 attacks in 1876, yet in 1881 she claimed that the defenders repulsed the Mexican assault troops 3 times. Did that mean their 4th attack was successful? Shielded in the church sacristy, along with the other non-combatants, Susanna Dickinson was in the worst possible location to view the battle. Indeed, the unnamed reporter in the 1881 Daily Express article admitted as much. Mrs. Hardin says she could give but little of the struggle, as she was in a dark room in the rear of the building. That is the constant quandary with her recollections. What she asserts in one, she contradicts in another. The most incriminatory feature of Mrs. Dickinson's multiple attack story is none of the other witnesses corroborates it. Joe, Travis's body servant, was standing by his master on the north wall and certainly in a better position to see the assault than Mrs. Dickinson, yet he never mentioned 3 Mexican attacks. Nor did any of the Mexican participants, not Almonte, not Caro, not Fiasola, not Pena, not Sanchez Navarro, not Santana. So far removed from the event, it is impossible to reconstruct what Mrs. Dickinson believed she might have heard. Most likely, she heard 4 Mexican assault columns hitting the walls at different times and interpreted them as separate attacks. Nevertheless, it is clear that her multiple attack fables does not survive scrutiny. So it's not going to be 10 myths after all. Let me go ahead here. During the battle, there was no hump and no upper windows.
You get another 5 minutes. How's that? Yeah. Go back.
Well, let me do myth 10 anyway. This is the most interesting. Myth 10. Santana commanded an army of liberation, while Alamo defenders, so often lauded as champions of liberty, were nothing more than mercenaries and land pirates who were fighting to preserve and expand slavery in Texas. It is foolish to attribute an event as complex as the Texas War for Independence to a single cause, yet increasingly many do. Consider, for example, the following observation. Jody, are you watching? In retrospect, rather than a fight for liberty, the 1835 Anglo-led Revolution was a poorly conceived Southern land grab that nearly failed. No mention of land speculation, no mention of the Constitution of 1824, no mention of the dissolution of Mexican federalism, no mention of ethnocentrism, no mention of efforts to install the centralist regime in Texas, no mention of Santana's vow to rid Texas of all perfidious foreigners. No, according to this persistent cant, the Texas Revolution was all about slavery. Period. Just accept it. Well, I might if I had not spent the last 30 years immersed in period documents. For example, the Declaration of the People of Texas, issued on 7 March 1835. Whereas General Antonio Lopez de Santana and other military chieftains have by force of arms overthrown the federal institutions of Mexico and dissolved the social compact which existed between Texas and the other members of the Mexican Confederacy, the good people of Texas, availing themselves of their natural right, solemnly declare, and the following 8 articles delineate their intentions and principles, but never mention slavery. Also mention or notice that the delegates were careful to publish a Spanish language edition of this document, those racist bastards. The Alamo garrison was extremely cosmopolitan. It strains credulity to claim that James Brown of Pennsylvania or John Flanders of Massachusetts or John Hubbard Forsyth of New York or Gregorio Esparza of Tejas, and especially Daniel Byrne from England, Lewis Johnson from Wales, Henry Kortmann from Germany, and Charles Zanko from Denmark would have risked their lives for a southern land grab. As a young man, I discovered a quotation from English novelist E.M. Forster that has guided me through my career. The historian must have some conception of how men who are not historians behave. Allow me to offer Hardin's corollary. Historians who view the world exclusively through the lens of race, class, and gender frequently forget that people ever lived who did not share their myopic perspective. Slavery was part of the toxic stew that led to war, but not the principal ingredient. Randolph B. Campbell, who literally wrote the book on Texas slavery, should have the last word. The immediate cause of the conflict was the political instability of Mexico and the implications of Santana's centralist regime for Texas. Mexico forced the issue in 1835. Well, what's a century among friends, damn it? Not over slavery, but over customs duties and the general defiant attitude of Anglo-Americans in Texas. So there. Quickly. Myth is an inalienable part of the Alamo story. Even if it were possible, efforts to purge the mythic context would prove unwise. As with Washington and the Cherry Tree, Travis and the Line is a homily that conveys a vital lesson. It is part of a shared national experience, and it constitutes a valuable cultural touchstone. It will certainly do children no harm to hear it, and it may even do them some good. Ponder the wisdom of C.S. Lewis. Since it is so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Understand and appreciate the myths. Understand and appreciate the historical reality. But please graze them in different pastures. Hazards arise for both individuals and societies, not when they treasure national myths, but when they begin to mistake those myths for history. Just ask the Germans. Myth reflects history. It does not verify it. The warped image it provides is that of a funhouse mirror, one that reveals more about the modes and motives of the people who devised and continue to embrace the folklore. Nevertheless, when one strips away the layers of legend and fabrication, what is left is still grandly heroic. Chauvinism may have steered A.B. Lawrence's pen, but he was not wrong. The story of the Alamo is remarkably complex, but at its core, it remains one of honor, virtue, and patriotism. Thank you very much.
We do have time for a few questions, and one of them could be, what was the other myth? But I'm not saying that. Anybody? Somebody else floor?
Dr. Hardin,
Yeah, John?
the line in the sand is obviously a myth, but is there any evidence that Travis did assemble the men at any time to explain to them what the situation was and give them a chance to leave?
I think so. I think there, and I discussed this in Iliad, there seems to be evidence that he did talk to the men, explain that there was a bad situation. Of course, we had no idea, we have no inkling of what was said, and there's no evidence to support the line. But yeah, I think he probably did call all the guys together and say, it looks grim.
Dr. Hartman,
Yes, sir.
there is a precedence for a line in the sand, and it's Pissarro, what he does in the Isle of Guile when he decides to have his
Yeah?
Did you want to stay with me and attack the Inca, or do you want to go back to Panama City? But I believe that the line in the sand was basically a way to vote for a large group of men, but not so much, well, do we fight and die here, or do we surrender unconditionally to Santana and probably work in the salt mines or whatever, be at his mercy, or do we try a mass escape? The men probably voted for the mass escape. And as a result, this is what the black watchwoman takes back to Santana, and he moves up his attack to the morning of the 6th, March the 6th. So I do believe there was a line in the sand, but it wasn't like you say for virtue, heroic courage, because the Battle of the Alamo should have never happened. Two big mistakes were made. First, Santana attacks a fortified site, and second, Travis gets himself trapped inside the fort when he should have fled when he started getting the spy reports that this army was moving up. So that's another view.
That's what you believe?
Yes, and boss, I sure do.
Okay.
So, Dr. Hardin, 4 years ago, I spoke with Mr. Donovan at the Hall of State in Dallas. And I told him I was very impressed with all the research he had done about the line in the sand. And you have quoted a couple of points that he also had referenced, and that was Susanna's testimonies and also Moses Rowe's experience. And it was a long story that he gave in his research about how he got to East Texas and explained all the sufferings that he had gone through and why he left and that type of thing. But there are other testimonies that he had also researched. And I said, it seems to me that you have done a lot of research on this, and you have stated in your book that you believe the line was drawn. Do you still believe that in what you
No,
put
in my book,
And I was asking him
oh,
that.
him. Okay.
And he said, yes, I do. The preponderance of the evidence indicates to me that Travis drew the line. Yes, I believe that.
Was there a question there?
Last question, please.
Yeah, hey Frank, I just wanted to mention that the...
Frank, thank you.
Don't worry, you're next.
I was trying to get out of the way. You apparently
No,
are
that
the crosshairs.
the Alamo de Paras company, whom my grandfather was with in 1803, I just wanted to mention that it was mentioned on a couple of occasions today, and I just thought I'd bring it up, that my great-great-great-great-grandfather was a soldado stationed with la Segunda Compañía Volante del Alamo de Paras. And Dr. Hardin,
I've created a monster.
Yes. You mentioned in your book that 80% of the combatants in the Texas Revolution, with all due respect, sir, you call them illegal rebels. So, was it a revolution or was it an invasion?
Did I say that?
Yes, sir. It's in your book.
Which one?
Texan
I call them...
80% of the combatants in the Texas Revolution were illegal rebels.
Well, I call them rebels.
Yeah.
They were rebelling against...
Yeah, but if it's 80% of the combatants, then that's not a revolution, that's an invasion.
Who's invading whom?
Well, to name a few, the Kentucky Long Rifles, the Georgia Battalion, the New Orleans Grays, the Tennessee Volunteers, to name a few.
Yeah. Well, they had been invited.
Can I get a round of applause for both our speakers here?